In the fall of 1982, a farmer named Reed Olmstead drove across the county road to his neighbor's farm in Champaign County, Illinois, sat down at a kitchen table that was not his, and wrote a check for $132,000. The 120 acres he was buying had sold for $228,000 6 years earlier. His neighbor, a man named Gerald Tice, had bought it in 1976 at $1,900 per acre when the agricultural land market was at its peak and every bank in central Illinois was happy to lend against the future of rising prices. Gerald had believed in the future of rising prices. Most farmers in Champaign County had believed in it in 1976. The Extension Service had believed in it. The farm credit lenders had believed in it. It had seemed impossible in 1976 that ground-producing $3 corn would lose half its value in 6 years. The ground had lost more than half its value in 6 years. Reed was paying $1,100 per acre for ground that Gerald had paid $1,900 per acre for. He was paying $132,000 for ground that Gerald had paid $228,000 for. The difference, $96,000, was the sum total of what the farm crisis had done to Gerald Tice's balance sheet expressed in a single transaction. It was not the only thing the farm crisis had done to Gerald's balance sheet, but it was the thing that was being signed at the kitchen table that October afternoon, and it was the thing that was going to restore Gerald's debt service ratio to a range his lender could accept. Reed Olmstead was 44 years old. He had been farming 280 Champaign County acres since 1968. He had 3 tractors on his farm, 2 combines, and a full set of implements. None of them were new. None of them carried a note. The most he had ever spent on a single piece of equipment was $4,200 for a used combine he had bought at an estate auction in 1974 and rebuilt over the following winter. He had paid for it in full on the day he bought it. Gerald Tice had a large green tractor on a 6-year note that he had signed in 1979. The note had 4 payments remaining when the farm crisis made the payments difficult and the lender called about the combined debt service. The note had been the specific weight that had tipped Gerald's position from manageable to requiring a sale. Reed had known this. He had not said it at the kitchen table. He had written the check and thanked Gerald for the opportunity and driven home. He had added 120 acres to a farm that had been 280 acres the morning before. His farm was now 400 acres. He had bought at the bottom of the market with money that had accumulated in his operating account because he had not been making equipment payments since 1974. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, has a farm crisis ever created an opportunity for someone you know? Let me tell you about the 8 years between 1974 and 1982, because the $132,000 Reed had available at the kitchen table in October of 1982 did not appear from nowhere, and understanding where it came from explains everything. In 1974, Reed had bought the used combine for $4,200 at the estate auction. That was his last significant equipment expenditure for 8 years. He ran 3 rebuilt tractors, a 1961 machine, a 1964 machine, and a 1969 machine, all bought broken at auction and rebuilt in his shop, and the rebuilt combine. He spent approximately $1,100 per year on parts, maintenance, and machine shop work for all 4 machines combined. Some years less, never more. Gerald Tice, across the same 8 years, had financed or refinanced equipment 3 times: a tractor in 1975 on a 5-year note, a new planter in 1977 on a 3-year note, the large green tractor in 1979 on a 6-year note. His average annual equipment debt service across the 8 years, principal, interest, the overlapping notes, was approximately $6,800. The difference between $1,100 per year and $6,800 per year is $5,700 per year. Over 8 years, that is $45,600 in accumulated difference. That is not $132,000. The rest of the difference came from Reed's operating surplus across 8 years of farming 280 acres above the county average yield. He averaged 9 bushels per acre above the county on corn across the period, on 140 acres of corn per year, which, at an average price of $2.40 per bushel, was approximately $3,024 per year in additional revenue above what a county average farmer was producing on the same acreage. Over 8 years, $24,192 in yield premium. Equipment savings plus yield premium. $45,600 plus $24,192 equals $69,792, not $132,000. The rest came from a decision Reed had made in 1976. In 1976, when Gerald was buying the South 120 acres at $1,900 per acre and the land market was at its peak, Reed had looked at the same ground. He had been offered a first look by the previous owner. The 2 farms were adjacent, and the courtesy had been extended. Reed had looked at the land and the price and the prevailing interest rate and had calculated what the land would need to produce to service the purchase note at $1,900 per acre at the 1976 rate. He had concluded it could not. The cash return on $1,900 per acre farmland at corn prices of $2.85 was approximately 4.2% before operating costs. The interest rate on a land note was 9.5%. The math did not work. He had passed on the 120 acres in 1976. He had put the down payment he had been considering into a short-term certificate instead. He had watched Gerald buy the ground at $1,900 per acre. The certificate, plus accumulated savings, plus equipment savings, plus yield premium, compounded from 1976 to 1982, gave Reed approximately $132,000 in liquid funds when Gerald needed to sell. Gerald had bought the ground in 1976. Reed had bought it in 1982. The difference between the 2 transactions was $96,000, which was the farm crisis, plus 6 years of carrying costs, note payments, and interest Gerald had paid on the land that Reed had not needed to pay. The equipment note and the land note together had been the weight that had required the sale. Reed had neither note. He had the check. Let me tell you about the almost quit moment, because it did not happen during the farm crisis, and it did not happen at a kitchen table. It happened in the spring of 1979, when the large green tractor arrived at Gerald's farm. Gerald had called Reed that spring, excited about the new machine. He had said, "Reed, I got the big machine. You should come look at it." He had said the horsepower number. He had said, "It's going to change what I can do in a planting window." Reed had gone over. He had looked at the machine. It was a fine machine. He had acknowledged this honestly to himself and to Gerald. More horsepower than anything Reed was running. A better cab. More hydraulic capacity. Gerald was not wrong that it would change what he could do in a planting window. Reed had driven home and sat at the kitchen table with his operating notebook. He had written down the payment number Gerald had mentioned. Gerald had volunteered it, proud of what he had arranged. And he had looked at the payment for a while. He had then written down what his equipment was going to cost him that year in maintenance and machine shop work. He had estimated $1,200. He had looked at the two numbers. He had thought about the machine at Gerald's farm. He had thought about being the farmer in the county who was running the older equipment when many of his neighbors were on the new machines. He had thought about whether the additional horsepower would make a measurable difference in his outcomes. He had concluded, on his operation, at his scale, with his implement sizes, the additional horsepower would save him approximately half a day during the planting window. Half a planting day, valued at the yield drag rate, was worth approximately $180 on his operation. He was being asked to pay the equivalent of thousands of dollars per year in note service for $180 in yield advantage. He had closed the notebook. He had gone to the shop and started the spring equipment service. He had never called the dealer. He had never told Gerald what he had calculated. Gerald had farmed with the large machine for 3 years, and it had made a difference in his planting window exactly as he had said it would. It had also made a difference in his debt service position when the corn price fell in 1981. Reed had not bought the machine. He had bought the math. The math had bought him 120 acres in October of 1982 for $132,000 at $1,100 per acre. Let me tell you about what the 120 acres became, because the October 1982 purchase is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different accounting. Reed had bought the 120 acres at what turned out to be within 6 months of the bottom of the Champaign County land market. The bottom had not been obvious in October 1982. Nobody rings a bell at the bottom. He had bought because the math said it was buyable at $1,100 per acre, and because he had the liquidity, and because Gerald needed to sell. He had not been trying to time the market. He had been responding to an opportunity created by a combination of Gerald's financial position and his own. By 1988, 6 years after the purchase, Champaign County farmland had recovered to approximately $1,600 per acre. The 120 acres Reed had bought for $132,000 was worth $192,000. He had made $60,000 in 6 years on the land appreciation alone, before the crop income from those 120 acres across the same period. By 1995, the ground was at $2,200 per acre, $264,000 for the 120 acres Reed had bought for $132,000 13 years earlier. By 2010, $4,800 per acre, $576,000 for the 120 acres. By 2024, approximately $10,500 per acre, $1,260,000 for the 120 acres Reed had written a $132,000 check for in October 1982. The equipment note Gerald had been servicing when the crisis hit had cost him approximately $18,000 in total before it was retired. It had contributed to a land sale at the bottom of the market that had cost him $96,000 in lost land value against his 1976 purchase price. And the land he had sold, which he had needed to sell because the note had been part of the weight that required it, is now worth $1,260,000. Gerald had bought it. Gerald had sold it. Reed had bought it at the bottom and has held it since. The note was $18,000. The land loss was $96,000 in 1982, and considerably more in the long run as the land appreciated while Gerald no longer owned it. Reed had written the check for $132,000. His son farms the 400 acres today, the original 280 plus the 120 from 1982. He has never made an equipment note. He has never needed to explain his debt service position to a bank. Gerald Tice retired in 1994. He had farmed the remaining 280 acres through the recovery years. He had recovered fully from the crisis. He had not lost his farm. He had sold a portion of it, which was not the same thing, and he had continued farming well through the 1980s and 1990s. He was a good farmer and a decent man, and he did not deserve the farm crisis any more than any of the other good, decent farmers it caught. He had said to Reed once in the late 1980s at the elevator, "Reed, I look at what that South 120 is selling for now, and I think about the $1,100 you paid me for it." Reed had said, "I was glad to have the liquidity when you needed to sell." Gerald had said, "I know." He had paused. He said, "The machine was the thing." Reed had said, "Yes." Gerald had said nothing more about it. The machine, the note, the weight that made the sale necessary at the moment when it was the worst time to sell. The equipment note had been the difference between who was buying and who was selling in October 1982 in Champaign County, Illinois. It has been the difference on every farm in every county in every crisis year since Midwest farmers started signing notes for machines they could have managed without. Reed had not signed the note. He had written the check. The 120 acres is worth $1,260,000. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, has an equipment decision ever put someone in your community in the position of buying or selling at the wrong time? The equipment note was the difference between who was buying and who was selling. Reed was buying. He wrote the check. The ground is still in his family. It will be there this spring. Let me tell you about Reed's 3 rebuilt tractors, because the rebuilt tractors are the mechanical foundation of the financial position that wrote the $132,000 check, and they deserve their own accounting. The 1961 machine had been bought at an estate auction in 1970 for $480. Reed was 32 years old and had been farming for 2 years. The machine had a seized front axle, a kingpin failure that had locked the front wheels in a straight-ahead position and made steering impossible. The estate had been unable to get it off the property without hiring someone to drag it. They had priced it at $480 accordingly. Reed had looked at the front axle and diagnosed the seized kingpin in approximately 10 minutes. He had bid $480. He had bought it. He had fixed the front axle the following weekend for $34 in kingpin and bushing parts. He had a running tractor for $514. The 1964 machine had been bought in 1973 for $620 at a sheriff's sale, a farm equipment liquidation in Ford County, where the operation had failed and the equipment was being sold to satisfy creditors. The machine had blown a hydraulic pump during the harvest the previous fall, and the failed operation had not had the cash to repair it. Reed had priced the pump replacement before the sale, had set his bid limit at $650, and had won the machine at $620. The pump had cost $87 to replace. Total investment, $707. The 1969 machine had been the most complex acquisition. Reed had bought it in 1976, the same year Gerald was buying the 120 acres, at an estate auction in Piatt County for $1,840. It had a cracked cylinder head and a worn-out front tire that had made it visually unappealing to buyers who were looking for running equipment. Reed had brought the head to a machine shop for a pressure test before the auction, something he had done at the owner's property on the auction preview day, which was permitted, and had confirmed the crack was in the water jacket but did not penetrate to the combustion chamber, meaning the head was replaceable rather than requiring a block replacement. He had found a replacement head from a parts dealer in Decatur. The head had cost $160. The front tire had cost $95. Total investment in the 1969 machine, $2,095. 3 tractors. Total investment, $514 plus $707 plus $2,095 equals $3,316. Running value of the 3 tractors in 1982, approximately $12,000 combined for machines in good mechanical condition. Gerald's large green tractor, purchased in 1979 for approximately $29,000 with $5,000 down and $24,000 financed, had a 1982 trade-in value of approximately $16,000. Still on the note, still losing value faster than the note was being paid down. Reed's 3 machines, purchased broken for $3,316 total, were worth 4 times the investment. Gerald's 1 machine, purchased new for $29,000, was worth approximately half the remaining note balance in trade value. These are the numbers that make the farm crisis's sorting mechanism visible. The crisis sorted farmers by their debt structure. Farmers with manageable debt structures, like Reed, came through with their operations intact and in some cases expanded. Farmers with heavy debt structures, like Gerald, came through having sold something or restructured something or lost something. The equipment note was not the only component of Gerald's debt structure, but it was the most controllable component. It had been a choice, not a consequence of weather or markets or anything outside Gerald's decision-making. It had been a choice that had seemed rational and had been rational until the crisis changed the conditions in which rationality was being measured. Reed had made a different choice. The choice had not been obviously correct in 1979 when the large green machine arrived at Gerald's farm. It had been correct by 1982. Let me tell you about Reed's son, because the inheritance is the most important part of this story, and it is the part that Reed cared most about. Reed's son, Warren, had been born in 1964 and had been farming alongside Reed since 1984, when he was 20, and had come back from 2 years at an agricultural college in Champaign. He had come back with knowledge and energy and the specific ambition of a young man who has been away and is ready to come home. Reed had put him to work in the shop that first winter, not as a junior partner, as a student. He had said, "Before you farm with me, I want you to rebuild that 1961 machine's engine. You know what to do from the college. Now do it here with your hands." Warren had done it. It had taken him from December through February. He had made mistakes. The valve clearances on the first reassembly had been off, and the engine had not run correctly, and he had pulled it apart and done it again. The second time had been right. He had started the engine in February, and it had run correctly. Reed had stood beside him when the engine started. He had said, "What did you learn?" Warren had said, "I learned that doing it wrong the first time teaches you what right feels like the second time." Reed had said, yes. He had looked at the running engine. He had said, "There is not a machine on this farm that I do not know the inside of." He had looked at Warren. He had said, "By the time you are farming this ground alone, there should not be a machine on it that you do not know the inside of either." Warren had taken this seriously. He had been at the shop through every significant repair and rebuild on the farm since 1984. He had done his own auction assessment since 1988. He had bought 6 machines at auction since he took over the farm in 1997, all of them broken, all of them correctly diagnosed, all of them running within a season of purchase. He has never made an equipment note. The farm is 400 acres, Reed's original 280 and Gerald's 120 that Reed bought in October 1982. The 120 acres that Gerald sold for $132,000 is currently appraised at $1,260,000. Warren does not carry the number in his head as a vindication. He carries it as a demonstration of what the long view produces when the short-term decisions are made correctly. Reed had written the check for $132,000 at Gerald's kitchen table in October 1982. Gerald had needed to sell. Reed had been able to buy. The equipment note had been the difference. That was the short-term decision correctly made in 1979 at a kitchen table of Reed's own. The $1,260,000 is the long view. The long view is the whole thing. Let me tell you one last specific, because the specific is where the argument lives, and the argument should not end in abstraction. In 1997, when Warren took over the farm from Reed, the 120 acres that Gerald had sold in 1982 was worth approximately $2,400 per acre. Warren's inheritance, the full 400 acres, the equipment, the operating account balance, was worth approximately $1,100,000. In 1997, Gerald Tice's son had been farming Gerald's remaining 280 acres since Gerald retired in 1994. He was running a newer green tractor on a 5-year note. He had a combine on a 6-year note. He was a good farmer, same as his father had been. Warren had driven past Gerald's son's farm in the spring of 1997. The first season he was farming the 400 acres alone. He had seen the new green tractor in the field. He had thought about 1979, which was before he was old enough to remember it clearly, but which Reed had described to him enough times that he understood what had happened. He had thought about $1,100 per acre versus $1,900 per acre. He had thought about the check Reed had written and why Reed had been able to write it. He had not thought about it with satisfaction or superiority. He had thought about it as a lesson in a specific form of learning that is only available if you live long enough to see the outcome. The lesson was, the equipment note had been the difference between who was buying and who was selling in 1982. And the person who had been buying in 1982 was the person who had decided quietly at a kitchen table in 1979 not to sign a note on a machine that looked impressive and could not justify its payment. Reed had made the decision. Warren had inherited the farm. Gerald's family is still farming 280 Champaign County acres. Reed's family is farming 400. The difference, visible in every planting season on the county road that runs between the two operations, is the south 120 acres that changed hands in October 1982 for $132,000. $1,100 per acre. $132,000 total. Currently appraised at $1,260,000. The equipment note was the difference between who was buying and who was selling. The ground says what happened. It always does. Let me tell you the thing Reed said when I asked him in his late 70s what he thought about when he drove past Gerald's former South 120 acres. He had been sitting in the kitchen of the farmhouse his father had built in 1941. The South 120 acres were visible through the east window. Flat Champaign County corn and soybean ground, tile-drained, producing above the county average the same way it had produced above the county average for Reed and was producing above it for Warren. He had looked at the window for a while. He had said, "I don't think about the price." I had said, "What do you think about?" He had said, "I think about Gerald at that kitchen table in October 1982. He had paused. He had his hat in his hands. He was wearing it when I came in, and he took it off when we sat down. He paused. A man who has to sell something he did not want to sell takes his hat off. He had looked at the window again. He had said, "I wrote the check. It was the right thing to do. For me, for my operation, for my son who is going to inherit what I built." He had paused. He had said, "But I thought about Gerald's hat for a long time." He had said, "The equipment note didn't break Gerald. The crisis broke Gerald's plan." The note made the breaking worse at the specific moment when it mattered. He had paused. He had said, Gerald was a good farmer. He had paused. A good farmer wearing his hat in his hands because the plan had not survived contact with $2.10 corn and 14% interest. He had paused one more time. He had said, "I didn't feel good about it. I felt right about it." He had looked at me. He had said, "Those are different things." I had asked, "Did you feel right about not buying the machine in 1979? He had said, "Yes." He had said, "I felt right about it then, and I feel right about it now, and the $132,000 check is why I feel right about it." He had looked at the window. He had said, "I passed on the machine in 1979, and I wrote the check in 1982. He had said, "One made the other possible." He had sat for a moment. He had said, "Gerald is a good man. I hope he knows I know that." I had said, "Do you think he does?" Reed had said, "I think he does." He had paused. "We've been neighbors for 50 years. Good neighbors say these things without saying them." He had looked at the window one more time. He had said, "The ground is right there. It's been right there since October 1982. He had paused. The note is gone. The crisis is gone. The ground is there. The ground is always there. That's the thing about putting the money in the ground instead of in the machine. The machine wears down and gets traded and disappears into someone else's equipment line or the salvage yard or the collector market. The ground stays. It stays in the county. It stays on the farm. It stays for whoever farms it next. Reed had passed on a machine in 1979. He had written a check in 1982. He had given a farm to his son in 1997. His son is giving it to his children. The South 120 acres is right there. It was there before Reed bought it, and it will be there after Warren farms it, and it will be there after whoever comes next. $1,100 per acre in 1982. $1,260,000 in 2024. The math does not require explanation once you have lived long enough to read it. Gerald's hat was in his hands. Reed wrote the check. The ground is still there, subscribed to The Honest Farmer. The equipment note was the difference between who was buying and who was selling. It always is. It always will be.